Hello and welcome. Today we discuss Bones Never Lie. This is a novel by Kathy Reichs. It's a suspense novel and this video will have spoilers. So you can watch this video once you're done reading the novel. And before I tell you the spoilers, I would also intimate, so you can log off at that time if you want to go ahead watching the video. I would be discussing the plot and also the techniques used by Reichs in the novel. Okay, let's begin with talking about Kathy Reichs. Kathy Reichs has been a forensic anthropologist by profession, and she's served in the office of chief medical examiner, and she's also been a professor of anthropology in the US. So she has actual experience of being an investigator and being an anthropologist working for investigation services. So she brings all these experiences to her novels, and her novels are actually best-selling novels. At the center of the novel, you have Dr. Temperance Brennan. And like the author, Brennan is a forensic anthropologist, and she investigates human remains at crime scenes. And she deals with such bodies where flesh is too degraded. Okay. And Brennan is shown to be a native of Chicago, and she's also one of the very few forensic anthropologists in North America, which is actually the case with the novelist as well. And as the series unfolds, we get to know that Brennan has had her own struggles, which she has overcome to become what she is, and she's very dedicated at her job. Okay. The events in the novel actually cover about 7 years from 2007 to 2014, and it is basically an investigation of deaths of teenage girls. And in total, 5 teenage girls have been found dead, and the victims are of one type. And in each case, the body is left out in the open, fully clothed, and exposed with no evidence of sexual assault. And in all the cases, deaths of or the cause of death could not be established. Okay, the victims' names are Nellie Gower, Lizzie Nance, Tia Estrada, and throughout the novel you have these names. And actually, names are very important for detective fiction. Okay, so each of these cases, the individuals are discussed. What were they doing? All these things are actually discussed. But as opposed to a traditional novel, the author would go into details about the hidden lives of the victims, about what they did, what could be the motive behind their deaths, all of those things. But here we do not get to know much about the victims. In fact, the focus is on the forensic evidences and the unusual nature of these deaths. Okay, the first suspect is a Canadian national named Annick Pomeroy, and she has had a male accomplice, and these people have been usual suspects, but they've been out on the run, and they've been usual suspects since 1985. Okay, so it's been a really long time since they've been on the run. So the first people that the police actually thinks could be the killers could be Annick Pomeroy and her accomplice. Okay, they come to this, they start suspecting Pomeroy mainly because one of the victims actually carries Pomeroy's DNA. However, as it happens in most detective fiction, the first suspect is never the actual suspect, right? So the novel progresses and we get to know that Pomeroy has also been dead since 2009, which means 7 or 8 years before these deaths had occurred, Pomeroy had already died. Okay. So now we are looking for a man, as male DNA is also found on the bodies. However, this detail is also a little misleading. The final perpetrator, the final killer, is not a man. Okay, so there are several twists and many clues are given in the novel, which we will not go into much detail of. There is a subplot of Brennan's mother who is sick. There is a potential romantic subplot as well, but none of this is explored too much in detail. The novel completely focuses on this investigation. There's another subplot of the protagonist Brennan having a cat, and she's really fond of her cat. She has a cat sitter who's a teenager, and she's very chatty and friendly. And towards the end of the novel, this cat sitter actually gets gets kidnapped as well, and in the very last moments of the novel there's a chase, and at the very last moment this child is saved. So those traditional formulaic pot boilers of sorts are also there in the novel. Now there's a spoiler alert. Now I'll be telling you who the killer really was. The actual perpetrator turns out to be a killer, the girl called Tawny McKee. Tawny had been tortured and held in captivity by Pomelo. Now Pomelo was the original suspect and she's been dead. Tawny had been her victim, and she had been her victim and abused by her for 5 years. Okay. So it is established that Tawny is the killer. But then why were we looking for a male suspect? Why did they why was male DNA found on bodies? The DNA actually belongs to Tawny, but Tawny has a genetic condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome, which makes her genetically male. So she has a genetic makeup like a man, but she's otherwise a woman. Okay, so she is physically a woman and she is developed like a woman. She feels like a woman. She's never menstruated though, and she does not have ovaries. So because of this medical condition, she has both the characteristics of men and women, and that actually baffles the investigators. Okay, now combined with this gendered complexity in her gender, and which is in combination of her history of staying in captivity, all this pushes her into further mental trauma, and she finds it very, very difficult to recover and then finally fit into the society. So a very complex backstory to the perpetrator, to the killer, has also been given to us. So when this detail about the killer is revealed, we get to know that the killer has been a victim and she's been replicating the deaths of her fellow victims who were with her during captivity. So when she was in captivity, lots of people who were with her also passed away, and she misses these people. And the women she kills, the girls she kills, are actually to remember, to recall the people who she had lost while she was in captivity. Okay. So now we get to know Tawny's motivation for these murders, and why did she go on committing all these murders, and all these young girls who meant no real harm to her. We basically get to know that that her psychological recovery, her recovery from trauma, was never complete. Okay, Reitz explains the psyche of the killer. First, she is reenacting the deaths of the original victims, but killing them quickly and leaving them out in the sun makes her feel that she's not making them suffer. Okay, but at the same time she's feeling sorry for these victims, so she's arranging the bodies neatly. She's not keeping these bodies in the dark, she's keeping them out in the open, because she had herself stayed in a basement for a very long time. So it's a very twisted psyche that she shows that the killer has. Okay, so the killer also kills her victims with a chemical called coral hydrate, which is never identified in autopsies. Okay, so that's another catch. And again, Kathy Reichs is very good at using all these scientific tidbits which the reader would never know, would never have the prior knowledge of. Okay, so all these work as suspense. So with the other thing that the killer keeps doing is that she keeps planting the DNA of her own kidnapper onto her victims. Okay, so the deaths are therefore motivated by hatred, they are motivated by a spirit of self-preservation. Basically, it's a very twisted psyche of the killer. Okay, we finally get to know that she will be imprisoned for these horrible crime, but she's also been a victim. Okay, and a court case would finally decide what is her mental condition, and in any case, even if she is it is decided that she's actually mentally unstable, she will be staying in captivity. Okay, so even the damaged cannot be allowed to damage further. Okay, this is where the novel ends. Okay, now let us discuss the themes of the novel and see what are the first questions that come to us when we talk about detective fiction and when we talk about detective fiction which rely on science for suspense. Okay, so the questions that we ask as readers is, how realistic is this? Okay, and does it create a false picture of actual crime and criminals? And how does the novel actually represent science? Okay, so the novels like these, like novels like detective fiction, make crime scenes very easy to detect. Okay, they represent crime scenes as if you can just decode them with little work. Okay, and science is very often projected as there is no room for interpretation, there's no room for debate at all, whereas in real life you may see that a person who is reading a report also has to do some interpretation of the reports. There are a lot of calculations that you may have to do in order to ascertain what could be the case, right? So this question can also be made from this novel. In fact, one does get a feeling that bones never lie. The title itself says that forensic sciences will finally, and in fact very easily, bring in clarity and bring in the truth, and that science would finally have an objective truth which it will bring to you, right? It feeds into that kind of perception about science. Okay, which is a difficult perception to have when we come to real life, right? So it is realistic, but it is plausible, it is possible, but it is not 100% realistic. And of course it doesn't have to be, it's finally a detective novel, right? But most scholars of crime fiction also believe that Reichs has kept the science very, very authentic. And in fact, I would link in the YouTube notes another essayist who has written about the novelist's use of science and how the science is actually very authentic. Okay, and in most of her interviews also, Reichs has maintained that she's very careful about presenting authentic science, and she often draws upon real life problems that she sees in police procedurals. But for her readers who do not have much of an understanding of science or of forensic evidences or expertise, it would be very hard for them to tell if there are any loopholes, right? So it works for the readers. Okay, so her novel therefore feed off the assumption that science will tell you all answers, but at the same time we also see that her investigators are not omnipotent. There are many details in that the investigators would never know unless the killer tells these details himself or herself. So some of the truth is actually left untold, right? For instance, in this example, in this novel, we aren't able to say whether Tawny was acting alone or if these girls were her only victims. They have to wait for Tawny to tell you what did she do, how did she do it. Okay, and even towards the end of the novel, all of this is not revealed. Okay, it is assumed that Tawny will have the details and she'll later confess to them. Okay, so the challenges faced by investigators are never just about some conspiracies but they're also about everyday problems like resources, like logistics, all of these problems. And there are other problems which the novelist also highlights. For instance, sometimes a good machinery would not be available to a lab technician, or sometimes a report would take too long to come, right? And sometimes they try to uncover truth by a method which does not work. So all those techniques are also used. Okay, so these limitations, which are actually limitations of real life, are also projected in the novel. So it's very realistic as it can be. Okay, how does then the novel build on the suspense? A traditional suspense novel would have many characters, and each character would be related to the victim, and there would be a backstory and hidden details would be found like a typical Agatha Christie novel. Reichs works in a very different way. She uses a well-formulated hypothesis that is falsifiable through testing, and that is falsified towards the end of the novel. So for instance, in this particular novel, the hypothesis is that the perpetrator is male, but finally that is falsified. Okay, So finally, we ask this question: does the novel tie up all loose ends? And the answer to this is that yes, it does. It explains every possible question, or the main question that comes to the mind of the reader, okay? Which is actually a cardinal rule of detective fiction. The killer was a victim of Pomelu and the original, who was the original suspect, but she ended up staying with the kidnapper for 5 years. So she clearly has a trouble fitting in the society, and her deviant behavior actually has a reason behind it. And the novel therefore does maintain that the psychiatrist of Tawny McGee did actually quite a shoddy job of bringing her back to normal functioning. Okay, so thus institutions that are in charge of rehabilitation need an intervention with respect to the practices that are needed to be followed. So this again is a very realistic factor that many institutions of rehabilitations face, and these problems are at the heart of most antisocial issues in society, as often the perpetrators are victims themselves, and that which molds them to become to continue the cycle of violence in a way. So the story is kept quite realistic, it's kept quite plausible, and the readers also resonate with such problems. Let's talk about the characterization for a bit. Reichs is able to humanize her characters. So the protagonist has a love interest, he's called Ryan. Ryan is mourning the death of his own child. The protagonist has a mother, she has an ongoing cancer treatment which is taking off. So basically it's projected that the investigator is any woman who has a difficult job to do, okay? And even the killer is given a solid backstory. And finally the reader is angry and disgusted by the killer, but also at the same time you feel sorry for the killer, right? And the novelist also tells us that getting to know who the killer is doesn't end the story there, okay? Most novels suggest that once the killer is found, the story ends there. Here Reichs tells us that that's not the end of the process. A litigation will now take place. A lawsuit would finally decide what happens to Tawny, right? And McGee's mental competence would be finally, and this is a quote from the text, McGee's mental competence would be determined by pre-trial motions, hearings, and judges and lawyers. Sane, insane. Either finding would result in Tawny McGee's worst nightmare, one she'd already endured, a life in one type of prison or another. So, there is complexity in the final denouement, in the final revelation also. Okay. Finally, the novel therefore does not villainize the killer. Tawny McGee is also a victim as much she is a criminal. Okay. So the novel does much more than I have communicated. There are many more details in the novel. If you want, you can actually read the novel. It's actually quite a well-written novel, as are most other books written by Kathy. So please comment on the video. Tell me what you like, what you did not like. If you like this video, please share it with a friend, and also let me know if there are any other topics that you would like to listen to or hear. I very often listen to the requests that are made to me. Thank you. I'll see you another time for another video.